Now then, it's time for today's perspective on Live from Paris and the war in Ukraine, climate change and food insecurity. Three issues, of course, blighting the world, but perhaps three issues as well, even more affecting Africa. Now, the continent under severe pressure, with that pressure as well continuing to build. Well, to try to help tackle that, France's development agency today publishes an African economy report, a report which sets out to provide an overview, if you like, of the continent's major economic and social problems. And with me is Thomas Melonio, who's the Executive Director of Innovation Strategy and Research. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us. Let's start off with the obvious economic problem of the day, the one we just talked about in the news as well, the Ukraine war. I mean, of course, it's affected people right around the globe, especially perhaps in Africa, would you say?
Well, I'd say first, we have some good news because we observed that in 2023, the GDP per capita in Africa is going to surpass again the level that it had in 2019. So the good news is that most of the COVID-19 shock has been absorbed. But as you were mentioning, the war in Ukraine has had consequences on the African continent. The first obvious one is inflation. So in 2022, inflation in Africa was around 10%. So it's a high figure, and it's expected between 8 and 9% in 2023. So the level of prices in Africa will remain high. If you go a little bit more into the details, of course, food and fertilizer are the first kind of products that where we observed a very high increase in prices. So the price of wheat, for example, or rice has increased twofold in 2022. Now the price is going down again, but still has not reached the level we had in 2020 or 2021. So I'm sure there are people watching us in African cities, and of course everybody knows that the access to rice or wheat is more difficult right now.
Has it got any better with, I mean, some of those ships have been able to get out from Ukraine, haven't they?
Well, yes, it's better, but still it's not as good as it was before. So access to food will remain an issue. Around 50 million people in Africa have seen their access to food deteriorate last year. We're also concerned about the access to fertilizers. As we have discovered or learned last year, the price of fertilizer is highly connected to the price of natural gas, which has dropped now, but it means the access to fertilizers last year has been more difficult, which probably is going to impact production this year.
What about climate change? I mean, Africa, of course, contributes relatively very little, doesn't it, to the increasing climate change problems, and yet it's probably set to be the worst hit continent, would you say?
Certainly so, mostly because of the place of agriculture in African economies, which is more important than in other continents. And it's agriculture, of course, will be the most impacted economic activity by climate change. There will be differences between the various regions in Africa. Northern Africa, for example, will suffer the most for a drop in rainfalls, which is not the case, surprisingly, in other regions like Sahel or Central Africa. So again, the physical impacts of climate change will highly differ between the several regions. That's mostly for agriculture. We begin to observe in certain cities the effect of sea level rise, together with, in some instances, the impact of human constructions and the fact that the soil can drop when too much pressure is applied on it. So in cities like Lagos, Alexandria or Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, we see the twin effects of sea level rise plus impact on soil erosion. So the impacts of climate change will be severe in agriculture, but doesn't necessarily mean that cities will be totally exempted from it.
Hearing that answer there, I mean, there's a whole list of things that are being affected by climate change. Are world leaders doing enough? I mean, the obvious answer is no, I suppose. But I mean, you know, we've got world leaders gathering, business leaders gathering in Davos at the moment. Is it high enough up on the agenda, if you like?
Well, I think there's a general understanding that we need to go more quickly because certainly currently we expect a global warming between 2.5 or 3 degrees, even slightly more than 3 degrees is still a possibility, while the Paris Agreement objectives, as you know, are between 1.5 and 2 degrees of global warming. So certainly we need an acceleration of effort. easier said than done. And of course, we'll need more financing to accelerate transition towards renewable energy or the reduction of deforestation. If you look at the situation in Africa, for example, the two main emitters in the continent are South Africa on the one hand, mostly due to the use of coal to generate electricity, and also the Democratic Republic of the Congo due to deforestation. So we see there are many different sources of global warming, even on the African continent, which means that different kind of efforts and financing will be required.
What do you say to people who, particularly in Africa, I made that point at the beginning that Africa actually contributes very little to global warming, but even people, for example, here in France, who might say, well, there's no point in us doing our bit when other countries like China, which I know you're also a bit of an expert on, and the US are not doing enough?
Well, if each and every country says that it's to the other countries to make the effort, then nothing will be done. So even when you represent 1% of emissions like France, you still have to do your part, and preferably more than just your part. Again, you were mentioning some disappointment, let's say the world in Africa, towards developed countries, and also maybe towards China, the biggest emitters in the world. It means we certainly have to reach the 100 billions of climate finance, which were promised. I think they will be reached. Maybe they were reached in 2022. We don't have the figure yet, or at the latest in 2023. EFD represents something like 6 billion of these 100 billion. So France has played, I think, a very significant role in climate finance, but I'm not saying it's enough. I understand the request for more effort from African countries.
There are other things you've looked at as well, aren't there? Like, for example, health provision, new technology, digital tech, that kind of thing, which is obviously really important to Africa.
Well, there's a lot of innovation in Africa, which means in certain instances the continent is able to leapfrog, and typically it's the use of cell phones has increased more rapidly in Africa than in other continents. We see lots of innovation among startups in the continent as well, to deliver medicines by drones. So we are very interested at EFD in looking at what's happening on the continent, so in some instances to observe or take innovations on the continent and bring it back to Europe.
A lot of positives, a lot of negatives as well in what you're saying. What's your overall assessment? I mean, can you be optimistic?
Well, you have to be realistic and optimistic at the same time. So, some people, the observers are usually classified into Afro-optimist or Afro-pessimist. I'm somewhere in the middle with a leaning optimist, considering the growth of the continent. And again, knowing the challenges, which is the purpose of that book, The African Economy in 2023, is really to observe the challenges so that they can be overcome by the actors on the continent.
And just very briefly, just time to ask you, when you put out a report like this, how much difference do you actually think it makes? What difference will standing up and saying this make?
Well, I think first recognizing the challenges, identifying the needs is central to mobilizing finance. There has been some disappointment in the mobilization of private finance for climate, for example, and part of it is because there are too few bankable projects in the eyes of the private investors. So knowing exactly where to invest, analyzing the economic models, I think is vital to mobilize private money.
Great to have you with us on the programme today. Thanks for coming in.
Thomas
Melonio, the Executive Director of Innovation Strategy and Research for the France's Development Agency. Thanks.